Thank you very much, Joseph. And good morning, everybody. Thank you, Patty, for the invitation to come. I have my cousin Mark McMurray, who's here joining me. His mom and my mom are sisters, both of whom are in recovery. His mom is about to we're also both adult children of alcoholics, and with all the baggage that comes with. Our grandmother died at 61, I think it was, and she wasn't found for a week because she lived alone and drank herself to death. And this was something that we never talked about in our family. The first time my mom ever said that she had a mother was when her mother died. I remember I was like shocked that I had this grandmother that I didn't know about. And so the silence around these issues is deafening. And I have spent my time trying to break my own feeling of shame and stigma, and break the silence. And sometimes it's not met with great approval. When I wrote my own story called A Common Struggle, I got a phone call from my brother who told me that this would permanently change our relationship. And of course, in the book, I said nothing more than my family suffered from alcoholism. I said nothing more than my dad suffered from drinking. And that was enough to appear as if I was disloyal to my family. And yet, I frankly didn't tell anything that the public didn't already know. You could walk into any bookstore and look up in the Kennedy section and find many books about and documenting my family's travails with alcohol. By the way, all through the prism of scandal and salacious kind of reporting. So it was no wonder that my brother was so angry at me, because when I was growing up, all we did was have to defend ourselves from all the, quote, haters who would constantly make our family's challenges with drugs and alcohol a scandal. So it was natural now for him to see me as the enemy. And yet, in a sense, I was very fortunate because I had all this stuff already out there, so I really didn't need to disclose anything that was not already out there. But I will tell you that I have never felt comfortable talking about this. And I never chose to be a leader in mental health and addiction. In my second term in the legislature, the fellow that I had been in drug rehab with at Spofford Hall in New Hampshire sold his story of being my roommate at drug rehab to the National Enquirer. So I woke up one morning and my chief of staff called me and he said, "You're not going to like this. You're on the cover of the National Enquirer." And of course, I knew that was not good news. Of course, it was not a flattering picture. And of course, the headlines were Patrick Kennedy, drug addict. So this was back in '91, so it was a really big deal. In other words, it was enough to kill my budding political career. I pretty much thought at that moment I should just call it quits. So I went over to my neighbor's house. So his name is Frank DiPaolo. And he was 87 years old at the time. He knew everybody in the neighborhood. And he was my campaign treasurer. And the reason he was my treasurer, even though he didn't have even a high school degree, was because he was so popular that I wanted to make him my treasurer, because under state law, you're supposed to put your treasurer's name on all of your political literature, your lawn signs, your pamphlets, and everything. And I wanted everyone in my neighborhood to know that Frank DiPaolo Jr. was with Patrick Joseph Kennedy. And so I, of course, never told him that I had been in drug rehab. And so I felt terrible, because now he was going to hear from all of his friends, see, we told you you shouldn't be with Kennedy. We told you he was a carpetbagger. We told you he was no good. And at that point, I was less worried about my own self-esteem, because it was already at rock bottom levels. I was more worried about the shame that I brought onto Frank. I had been first elected against a guy named Skeffington. And in my neighborhood in Providence, Rhode Island, it was half Irish American, half Italian American. And so Skeffington and I split the Irish vote. But the Italian vote was up for grabs, and that was another reason I had Frank DiPaolo Jr. on all of my literature. So I went to Frank's house. He was literally at his stove stirring his pasta fagioli, and he would not turn around and look at me. You know, of course, the National Enquirer was on every checkout counter in my district. You couldn't go to the dry cleaner or the pharmacy or the food store and not see this, National Enquirer. So I could tell, was very, very upset. And then he just kept shaking his head, and I was like, oh. And then he turned around and he said, buddy, that rat bastard. And I did not know what he meant, because I had grown up in McLean, Virginia, and I was not familiar with the nomenclature rat bastard. And I quickly found out that when I was going into the next election, that the only thing my predominantly Italian American constituency hated more than drug addicts were people who ratted on drug addicts. And Frank kind of put the word out, we're going to stand with Pat, not the rat. And that was my campaign slogan. So when I ultimately got elected to Congress, it was easy for me to put my name on bills that had to do with mental health and addiction, because I wasn't so self-conscious about the press asking me, well, do you have a mental illness? Do you have an addiction? Because everybody already knew. So when I got elected to Congress, I thought if I could be in the top 100 co-sponsors of a bill that prohibited insurance companies from discriminating against people with addiction and mental illness, I would be lucky. Because I was a freshman member. I was 27 years old, the youngest member of Congress from the smallest state in the country. And I thought, I'm the lowest guy on the totem pole. In Congress, like in your state legislatures, to sponsor a really powerful and popular piece of legislation, you have to have a lot of gray hair or no hair at all, because you have to be around the place for decades. You have to be chair of a committee. You have to be majority leader. And so hence my late father, Senator Edward Kennedy, was sponsor of Meals on Wheels. My father was sponsor of, increasing the minimum wage. My father was sponsor of, disability insurance. He had his name number one on every piece of progressive legislation. Voting Rights Act. He wrote the original Voting Rights Act. So you can imagine my surprise when I asked the clerk of the House, where do I sign on to the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act that prohibits insurance companies from discriminating against treatment for illnesses of the brain? And the clerk of the House said, Congressman Kennedy, no one's introduced that bill. If you want to sponsor it, it's all yours. Now think about that for a minute. I was the youngest member of Congress from the smallest state in the minority party, and yet I got to put my name first on that bill. Because none of my colleagues in Congress wanted to put their names next to a title of a bill that had the words mental in it and had the words addiction in it. Because, of course, they were worried about the 25 additional questions that would come about whether they or their families had ever experienced either one of those illnesses. And so I got to be sponsor of Mental Health and Addiction Equity Act and leader of Mental Health and Addiction Equity by default. By default. Because no one else had chosen to put their name first. So, when I get named as the leader, it's really no choice of my own, in the sense that I walked into it first because this guy ratted on me, and two, because no one was willing to beat me to the punch to be sponsor of this bill. And if that guy, Rob Remy, by the way, is his name, want to know the other thing Frank said to me after he said rat bastard? And this is a legitimate story. I'm not making this stuff. He turned around and he said, buddy, you want me to do something about this? And I said, no, Frank, I've already got the reputation as a drug addict. I do not want to be a co-conspirator to breaking someone's legs. Because the guy lived in Massachusetts. And anyway, but I started to realize how blessed I was that this guy ratted on me. Because if he had ratted on me, I wouldn't have been sponsor of that bill. And I would not have spent my time in Congress working on an issue that was intensely personal to me, because everyone in my family had suffered from mental illness and addiction. Obviously, my two uncles were murdered, and all my cousins grew up without fathers, and my dad grew up constantly worried about whether he was going to get murdered. We grew up with bulletproof vests in every one of our closets in case someone came storming through the door. I mean, we did not know what post-traumatic stress was back then, but I can tell you, if there was a person that qualified for it, it was my late father. So for me to be able to work on something that had everything to do with my own experience was liberating. That did not mean I got sober. So here I was, the sponsor of the mental health parity law, and yet I was still drinking and drugging. I thought, well, if I could get over cocaine addiction, then I was all right. I could drink. And we all know those stories. And then I finally had to go to detox for drinking, so couldn't do that anymore. But then I thought, how lucky am I, because now I don't have to jeopardize my political career by walking into a cocktail party, shit-faced. I can now take, and by the way, it didn't hurt that I had just gotten surgery, you know, the Oxycontin that I was prescribed for my back surgery that I got. And this was in the 90s, and of course Purdue was spending gajillions of dollars to buy off the American Medical Association and the federal government to fast track their ability to prescribe Oxycontin everywhere. So being a member of Congress, you know, and having, by the way, a nice scar down the middle of my back, I could just, all I needed to do to get a doctor to prescribe for me is turn around and he'd look at my scar and he'd go, wow, that must be painful. And I'd say, yep, you know, at least 30 with several refills will just do the trick. And then, of course, there was no prescription drug monitoring program. So I got to go to every pharmacy in southeastern Massachusetts and in Rhode Island and pick up prescriptions. And none of them knew that I just picked up one down the street. So, but because I was a member of Congress and my staff didn't want to tell me that I had a problem, because, you know, I was a congressman, they weren't going to confront me. We know how much we want to confront someone with this disease anyway, which is not at all. And then you layer on top of that their jobs depend on, you know, me thinking they're okay, and what am I going to think of them if they confront me on it? So, needless to say, I went in and out of detox for 6 more times and 3 more DWIs. I got arrested at the airport in Los Angeles for running through the security to catch a red eye. And then I got arrested by the United States Coast Guard, which is not easy to do, by the way. But I succeeded in doing it. I mean, it was terrifying. The big Coast Guard cutter pulling up beside my sailboat off Fisher's Island in Connecticut at 2:30 in the morning because my female passenger had complained to her boyfriend that she was with me, and he didn't like that, so he called the Coast Guard saying she was in distress and needed to be taken off the boat before I had a chance to get my arms around her, and that I got arrested for that. So then last one was I got up one morning at 3 in the morning and I put my suit and tie on and I drove my Mustang convertible to the Capitol thinking that I had to vote at 3:15 in the morning. And I ran in to the barrier that's supposed to keep Osama bin Laden and his friends from storming the Capitol. Little did they know that they were going to erect a barrier that was going to keep me from getting to the floor of the United States Capitol to vote. So my last DWI, I came back from rehab, and of course this one really kind of reminded everybody that I was a drug addict. So I was back in the halls of Congress thinking again that my political career was over, and I kept having colleagues of mine, many of whom I didn't know, many of whom were on the other side of the aisle, stop me in the halls of Congress and take me aside and tell me about their own struggles with addiction and tell me their own struggles in their families with addiction and mental illness. I ended up making friends with more of my Republican colleagues than I could have ever done if I hadn't gotten the DWI. I was invited to speak to the prayer breakfast, which is all the far right, you know, middle America, red state, Christian coalition who go to the basement of the Capitol every morning for their prayer breakfast. And I would go down there, and they kept asking me to speak. And I would tell them tales of utter debauchery, and they loved it, every minute of it. And then they'd all lay hands and pray for me. But it was interesting because when I ultimately got the parity bill to the floor of the House, I had a lot of those same Republicans vote against it after they told me about their daughter with an eating disorder, their wife who tried to take her life, their father who had taken a shotgun to himself. All of that stuff, they voted no. So, of course, I never broke any of their anonymity. I went, and I would stop them now in the halls, and I'd say, how was it that you voted against this bill? I thought we had this conversation. And they said, Patrick, we come from the buckle of the Bible Belt. In my part of the country, they look at these as moral failings, not medical failings. And if I were ever to have voted for that, my press would have come and interrogated me about why I was supporting that. And Patrick, if they ever bothered to really dig in, they might find out that my daughter has been hospitalized. And if she ever feels the shame of having been outed, I can't trust the fact that she wouldn't take her life. So I was like, hey, keep voting now. Keep voting now, because that's the fear that was in Congress when we passed the parity law. And then my dad ended up being the sponsor of the parity law in the United States Senate. And that happened, again, not by his own volition. It happened because the Democratic sponsor of parity was Paul Wellstone. And Paul was tragically killed in a plane crash. And so it fell on my dad, who was chairman of the committee, to assume sponsorship of the parity law. The only problem was the insurance industry wrote the Senate bill. And the House bill was written by Jim Ramstad, my Republican co-sponsor, who was also in recovery and who was instrumental in my life in so many ways, including supporting my recovery after I left Congress. So we had to, if you can get this, I had to negotiate, because we had passed our bill in the House, which covered all DSM, including alcoholism, addiction, trauma, and depression, anxiety. The Senate only passed a bill that covered bipolar and schizophrenia. So I had to come up with a, quote, compromise bill with my father. Now, if you can get this, I'm sitting at the table telling my dad that his bill doesn't cover any of the illnesses that affected our family, but that my bill would cover our family because our family had addiction and trauma, which were not covered in his bill. And so we were at a stalemate because even though my dad wanted to support our bill, he felt constrained because there was this feeling like if we push too much, we won't get anything passed. And what ended up happening is both bills stayed on their respective desks, the House bill on the Senate desk, the Senate bill on the House desk. And we came up in 2008 to the election. And if you don't pass a bill within a finite period of time during a Congress, you have to start all over again the next Congress. So I was feeling anxious about having to go through all of the various committees and testimonies and getting the votes to pass it. So I went to my dad, who at that point was dying of a glioblastoma, and I said to him, Dad, can you help me pass this bill, our House bill, H.R. 1424, out of the Senate? If you call somebody there, the leadership may let it pass because they owe you so much. And he said yes. So he called his best friend, Chris Dodd from Connecticut, and Chris was on the health committee with my dad that marks up the bill. And then I called Chris. I said, Chris, can we get this HR 1424 passed? He said, I'll try to figure out a way. Because by the way, it costs a lot of money because it requires Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to factor in that now the federal government will be on the hook for paying for treatment for addiction and mental illness. So what happened? Literally 2 weeks later, the markets crashed. You remember in 2008 when the banking crisis happened? Well, Chris Dodd wasn't just on the health committee. He also happened to be chairman of the banking committee, which put him in a pretty good spot to do pretty much anything he wanted because we had the biggest banking crisis in our nation's history. And so Chris called me up and he said, Patrick, I have an idea for passing your Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. I said, what's that, Chris? He said, how about I write the Economic Stabilization Act, the Toxic Asset Relief Program, which includes $800 billion to bail out the banks, into HR 1424, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, and I guarantee it's going to pass because we have no solution other than to pass it. The problem is, Patrick, you will become the sponsor of the largest federal bailout in our nation's history. And this was not a popular bill, if you recall. I said, fine, I'll take that. So the bill passed, and it was on the George W. Bush's desk. And the bill basically was passed to keep our country from sliding into another financial depression, another Great Depression. But I can guarantee you when George W. Bush signed that bill, he had no idea that the underlying bill required treatment for depression, in addition to the bill trying to save our country from a financial Great Depression. And to this day, I feel enormously blessed that at the time, I was Ted Kennedy's son, Chris Dodd was Ted Kennedy's best friend, and Chris tried to do this and did this because he was friends with my dad and because then he was chairman of the banking committee. So I'm just here to tell you, we do not have this parity bill because somehow Patty and Dan Gillison from NAMI and Schroeder Stribling from Mental Health America and Saul Levin from the American Psychiatric Association and Arthur Evans from the American Psychological Association and on and DBSA and everybody came up to the Hill and did a march on Washington. We ended up passing this bill in basically the dead of night, and no one knew what it was. And I'm saying that to you because we cannot count on things going our way like that again. That was a fluke, absolute fluke. If we want to change this overdose and addiction crisis, if we want to change the trajectory of suicides and overdoses, we need to be active citizens. We need to hold our elected officials accountable. And we need to borrow a page from the AFL-CIO, or if you will, the League of Conservation Voters, or if you will, the Chamber of Commerce. You know what these groups do? They say, you don't vote our way, you don't get our endorsement, you don't get our votes. And we all may be happy that we got an additional $11 billion last year for this cause, and compared to 10 years ago where it was like $500 million, That's big. Did you know that that's half of what we gave HIV/AIDS when we were at the height of the AIDS crisis and losing 53,000 Americans every year to HIV/AIDS? Because they were spending $24 billion a year. Because there was this group called ACT UP. And you know what ACT UP did? They went to every single congressional town hall meeting and acted up. And you know what ended up happening? There wasn't a member of Congress, a presidential candidate, a candidate for any office in this land that didn't face the music constantly. And ultimately, they got combined therapy from FDA, they got mandates for coverage, they turned HIV/AIDS from a fatal illness to a chronic illness. Exactly. And that's the same issue that we have today. Now, I can say, thanks to Faces and Voices of Recovery, that I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means for me that I've not had to use pills, pot, powder. I've not had to drink or use drugs since February 22nd, 2011, because Patty because Patty told me it was not a violation of the 11th tradition to say it that way. That I have made no mention of what 12-step group I'm part of. I say I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means for me I've not had to drink or drugs since February 22nd, 2011. I only wish the 30 million of us out there who do not know what Faces and Voices of Recovery knows could get our message so that we could take the 30 million Americans in long-term recovery and put a spotlight that they are amongst us and they are living happy and joyous and free from the scourge of drug addiction and alcoholism. And they would smash this mistaken notion that no one gets better. Because, as we know, we often don't treat these illnesses till they're stage 4. We have to start treating them early. Now, both sides of my family, addiction didn't just run in my family, it galloped. Now, if in the future, I've got my 5 kids, they're all predisposed, I want their pediatricians, their obstetricians, their orthopedists, their oncologists, their heart and disease and doctors to all be careful what they prescribe my kids. And I want to make sure, wherever possible, that I keep things like pot shops from being in my neighborhood, because I'm all for decriminalizing marijuana, but I'm not for a company that makes money in trafficking addiction. Because I was the alcohol industry's best client. And when they say drink responsibly, 80% of their revenue comes from 20% of the drinkers. They come from people like us. They don't want us to drink responsibly. And I can tell you, any addiction for profit company, their bottom line is hooking more consumers, just like big tobacco did, just like the liquor industry still does. I was just at a baseball game with my kids, the Little League, we took them up to the Phillies. Do you know, instead of your Budweiser here, your Budweiser, you know what they were saying? They said, get your soda, get your gin and spritzer, get your vodka and juice, because it was like the White Claw and everything. I don't want to give too many names out, but my fellow parents were getting bombed. Now, they would have had to drink 10 buds for what they were getting in that vodka-infused soda. My point is, you look at Purdue Pharma, well, why were they making so much money off of addiction? And then you've got sports betting. That's going to be a monster for our country. Absolute monster. And you know what? All of our states are going to be addicted to the money that comes in from sports betting. And if you have a gambling addiction, that's the highest correlation to suicide of any diagnosis in the DSM, is gambling addiction. So what I'm saying is, we need to be about treatment, we need to be about prevention, we need to be about community supports, we need to be about reimbursing sober homes, recovery residences, we need to be about investing in recovery community organizations like ours in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, called Anchor Recovery. We need to be about, recovery-friendly workplaces. We need to be about peer supports. We need to be about all of that. But we also have to be realistic that all the public health dollars in the world are not going to compete with the addiction for-profit industry. And we have an obligation to do whatever we can, because it's going to be those family members with the predisposition for addiction that are going to fall victim first. So let me just conclude by saying that the reason I was invited up here today was to promote my book. And I haven't even mentioned the title of the book yet. But after I did A Common Struggle, which was my story, and people would ask me, what's so common about a Kennedy and me? And I said, it's because we both lived in the shame and silence of these illnesses. Yale to jail. But I got so much feedback from people when I was on my book tour. I thought to myself, they don't know what it's really like to struggle with these illnesses. Everyone now, Simone Biles, God bless her, and Michael Phelps, and these Hollywood actors and actresses all say they have diagnoses. They all say they're in recovery. But the general public has no clue. What does that look like? How does that manifest in their lives? How do they struggle getting treatment? How do they struggle with interpersonal relationships? How do they struggle on the job? These are the real stories of what it's like to live with one of these illnesses. And we have to tell everybody it's not just us who are suffering, it's everyone around us. And we have to understand these illnesses so we don't think there's some quick, easy fix. Because to solve these challenges, we need a public health approach, and like I just mentioned, you need all of these different pieces to come together in terms of a comprehensive, wraparound system of care, not some codes for reimbursement. But the sober housing, the clubhouses, the recovery community, all of this stuff, which most of it's not covered by insurance to begin with. So we have to have this idea that we need a holistic thing. So we need to understand the multi-pronged approach. That's what I think we need. So in this book, now I'm going to tell you the title, called Profiles in Mental Health Courage, I interviewed 12 people, all of whom use their real names, and all of whom tell their real stories in detail. And in the back of the book, I have a QR code to a policy agenda called the Alignment for Progress. I like the idea of alignment. Because if you think about what's going to get more people better, you have to align the social drivers of health, the medical management, detox, medication management, the mental health counseling and cognitive behavioral therapy, and the community support systems. It's a three-pronged illness is what we've learned. A three-legged stool. If you take out one of the legs, the whole thing is going to fall over. And what does our country do? It does one thing, but not the other two. So what we need is a multi-pronged approach. It doesn't mean we can't do this. It just means we have to have our eyes wide open when we go into solving this problem. And every federal and state and county and municipal agency all silos those systems of care. So you don't have, how do we take care of you like it was a hurricane? You know, FEMA goes in there, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and when you know what they do? They go, what do you need? Oh, you need clothes? We got that covered. What do you need? Oh, housing? We got that taken care of. Food? Oh, yeah. Shelter? Good. You need medical care? Yes, that's what FEMA does. We need a FEMA, which incorporates all of our, because we're facing a natural disaster. I mean, you can see all the hurricanes and tornadoes in the Midwest and the Northeast. You can see all the fires in the West. But you can see people living on our streets like dogs, people locked up in our jails and prisons while being prisoner of their illnesses. And you can say to yourself, how is that not a natural disaster? And how come we can come in and solve all of these other natural disasters, by the way, and spend tens of billions of dollars to solve these other and not solve this problem? It's a matter of political will. So what we need to do is align for progress, which means, some people need more of this than that. What's the end result? How do people live with stability in their lives? How do they define recovery? How do we help them live that definition of recovery for themselves? That's what we need. And we need the political organizations. First, we need to get all the faces and voices of recoveries, all the NAMIs and MHAs and DBSAs and eating disorders, everything else. We need to get them all together like the AFL-CIO. And we need to light up the map in this country so anyone running for office, whether it's a state rep, a federal Congress, senator, governor, when they look at their political campaign and they look and go, oh my God, look at all the people in my district who care about this issue. And then the Patties and the Dans and the Arthurs all get together as the leaders and say, what is going to be our asks? Well, we're not going to be satisfied taking crumbs from the table anymore. We're going to require, by the way, that Federal Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act gets enforced. Because I have to say, I passed the bill, but trying to get the thing enforced is impossible. Why? Because the insurance industry has so much money, and they have a stranglehold in Congress. I will say the Biden administration's trying to enforce that right now, and I give so much credit to the Employee Benefits Security Administration. Does anyone know what the Employee Benefits Security Administration, they manage 80% of your health insurance plans. And no one knows what the hell EPSA has got to do with it. It's like Tina Turner. What's EPSA got to do with it? It's got everything to do with it. And you know what? The insurers, everyone else doesn't want you to know that. Because there's this woman, Secretary Gomez, who's stuck in the bowels of the Department of Labor. No one knows who she is. And you know what? She has more say over saving more lives of our fellows than anyone else. And how many of us know who she is? So my point is, we need to get politically active and say that. We'd be great to have a right of action, which means we could sue insurance companies, because then we wouldn't have to rely on the federal government to do the regulations. Because if a certain person is in public office that doesn't, is kind of in the pocket of the insurance industry, we're screwed. And I can guarantee you, when the largest health insurance company in this country, named United, can literally get caught red-handed making up their own medical management criteria that they use to determine whether you and your families get access to mental health and addiction care and get access to the right level of mental health and addiction care and get access to the right duration of mental health and addiction care. When they make up their own medical management criteria and do not follow anything from ASAM, we're in trouble in this country. And you know what? No one knows about the Witt decision. And, United loves it that way, because they can keep denying care. The biggest liability they have is being mandated to provide coverage that they should have provided 10 years ago, but it's too late because you're already dead. I would love to have an ACT UP be able to go, and I would not target United. Everybody knows their insurance, that's what they're going to do. I'd like to go to Comcast. I'd like to go to Salesforce. I'd like to go to American Express. I'd like to go to Bank of America. I'd like to go to Costco and Walmart, and I want to have us outside while their employees are walking in and hand them the scorecard for parity. So they're coming in and we say, did you know your health insurance is United? And did you know United has been found guilty on all counts in a federal court, in multiple state courts, and you and your family are insured? Now, here's my thought, is they'll walk in and they'll go, what the hell is this all about? Especially these Gen Zs, Gen X and Gen Zs. They're gonna they're not gonna have any of this bullshit. They're gonna be like, what the F is going on here? And they're gonna be like complaining to their manager, and their manager's gonna call upstairs to the C-suite and go, Mr. CEO or HR, what's the deal with our insurance? I could go to other jobs. That's an existential crisis for businesses in this country. And you combine that with the fact that they'll know that, frankly, if they give us more mental health and addiction care, it's going to reduce their total cost of care. And not just that, it's going to make everybody more productive. And not just that, it's going to reduce the churn in employment every year. And not just that, it's going to reduce the amount of disability in the workplace. So we need both the carrot and the stick. And we need the economics and the benefits to show people this makes their self-interest to follow the parity law. And we also need to tell them that there's a blowtorch behind them if they don't follow it. And I wrote, I didn't write it. I got a guy, honestly, that wrote it for me. So, brilliant writer. Makes it much more readable than if I had written it. His name is Stephen Fried. Great guy. These 12 stories, everybody tells everything. And why? Because they want everyone else to not have to go through the mayhem, the chaos, the discrimination that every one of us goes through in our lives when trying to get access to care and the right care. And so after the 12 people tell their stories, and by the way, I interviewed their families, they're included in it. I have this QR code to a national strategy, which, by the way, I consulted You guys on terms of what's in it, ASAM on, NAMI on, MHA, because this is not my stuff, but I'll take credit for it if you want to know the truth. That's why I call it the alignment for progress. And if we can do that, then I will tell you the greatest satisfaction in my life was not passing the parity law, even though that was great, and the great hug that I got from my father when I walked out the White House, when in the first time in his whole life he told me I was doing good. That was not, you know what? It was when I went to 12-step meetings, and friends of mine in recovery in the 12-step meetings talked about being denied care when I was still in Congress. And I said, give me your insurance information. And they gave it to me. I'd go back up to my office. I'd find the lobbyist for those insurance companies. And I'd call them up and I'd say, yes, take down this number. Okay, Congressman. Get the claim paid for ASAP. What? I said, well, I'm about to go to the floor of the United States House of Representatives and talk about how you're denying care for this person. And they said, don't worry, Congressman, don't worry, we'll take care of it. And you know what? Better part of my last few years, including members of Congress, I had one of my colleagues, Republican, who did not want to be known that his federal employee health benefit plan denied him coverage for his stint in rehab during a Christmas vacation because he couldn't afford to have his constituents know about it. He couldn't get it paid for. He called me up and said, can you call on my behalf? So, you know, we all know it's the best feeling in the world, which is why we're so blessed, because we make out when we're helping others make out, and we pass this thing forward. Thank you all for what you do to do that. Thank you so much.